the World Health Organization to totally give the services to the people with disabilities, and we are trying to multiply this experience and making it cashless. So there are total things which are our mission. There are things which we are implementing, but of course they cost money. I would like this dialogue to take place not only between the board and the owner, who is interested to implement this social function, but between the independent supervisory board, which would include at least 6 independent members, and the owner. And then it would be much more full of sense and substantiated. From the point of view of the problems how to form the supervisory board, it is a huge problem. The law on the foresees that the supervisory board has to be prepared, and this report has to be approved by the independent audit according to the results of the year. The question of responsibility, the issue of qualification, the issue of internal regulations, the issue of cooperation, all of those issues which, after the formation of the new supervisory board, will have to implement together with the strategy of the development of the bank and to begin the work of all of the above mentioned. But without that, to speak about any perspective of the bank, I wouldn't even speak about that. This change of the corporate governance system is necessary and compulsory for our existence. The change of the corporate governance is necessary and compulsory to improve our cooperation and strategic cooperation with the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. And this is the further issue of privatization, because the state, as for the further fate of Oshad Bank, has already defined the fate. They should take into account the capital, and the first stage foresees the involvement of the EBRD and then the development of this success through the public shares. Thank you, Andrea. As far as I understand, the first 2 speeches are the following. We have the strategy. Maybe it's a bit too slow as for its implementation, or maybe it doesn't answer all of the issues of the funding of the social function, but overall it exists. Shevki.
In your capacity as the chairman of the board of a state-owned company, do you think, and obviously I take it for granted that everyone in the audience is aware that although supervisory boards with majority of independent board members are being established at the state-owned companies, the scope of their authorities is a bit different from what the best practice and the standards and the consultants advised. And so, you know, the boards are a bit restrained in their capacity to achieve the results. Do you think if the state ownership policy is developed and exists for the state-owned companies, will it be easier for the government to sort of entrust more powers into the independent boards?
Let me try to make an analogy here. Clearly, this government and the previous governments have moved down the path of embracing the principles of corporate governance for state-owned enterprises, but the political spectrum, of course, covers more than just the government itself. And there are a number of still politicians in the Rada for whom the corporate governance is like your 18-year-old daughter. You will allow her to go out and have the board meeting until late, but you want her to be back by midnight. And this is, at the moment, the reality. And your reference to whether or not there is enough empowerment, the short answer is not yet. And my board, we have prepared a number of changes to empower the supervisory board with basic governance authority. We presented to the government, and we are hopeful that those changes will take place because they don't require necessarily parliamentary approval. They are within the domain of the government. But if we really look back into why Ukraine has underperformed over the last 26 years, people could say this, that, corruption. No, I would say it is lack of governance, because it is the lack of governance that leaves space for corruption. It is the lack of governance that leaves incompetent management in place. It is the lack of governance that allows to be untransparent, and a number of things that, unfortunately, in the past have constrained our economic development in this country. So, to the extent that we can change that mindset, we realize that, yes, the state, the people of Ukraine are the owners, and they have the ultimate authority to make key guiding decisions, principles for the supervisory board, and that's what you're referring to as a state ownership policy. And you and I have discussed a lot, you know, there needs to be at two levels. One, at the broader level of state ownership policy as to why certain activities still should be conducted by the state. And then at the individual enterprise level, you know, this would set the framework for the board of directors, then to set the strategy, set the plans, you know, assess the management, whether or not it's fit for that particular strategy, and work in the best interest of all stakeholders. Because the key role of the supervisory board is to balance the interest of the variety of stakeholders that each enterprise has, not just the state as the shareholder, but the customers, suppliers, the public, all those interest groups that the institution is supposed to serve, their interest is supposed to be balanced by the board. And that is where this empowerment, assignment of responsibility to the board within the guidance, within the framework of the state ownership policy comes into play. That's what it's all about. Giving the powers, but also the accountability for delivering the results to the professionally selected people. And if they can't deliver, to change them with those that can do it there. So that is, I think, you know, a very long answer to your short question. As we move along the path of changing the concept of, or the understanding of what state ownership is about among our various politicians, that will work for the benefit of our country.
Thank you, Shevki. Ivan, well, to me, in state-owned company sector, there is no formalized or published state-owned policy. But maybe internally, inside the government, there is a state ownership policy which is in minds and in hearts, and you know, it's clear what are the objectives, next steps, priorities. It just, you know, there is no legal mechanism to introduce it, or no time, or, you know, other reasons. Is that so, or it's being developed? You know, how do you assess the current situation with the state ownership policy in Ukraine?
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, I'm not ready and prepared to speak on behalf of the government. I'm not a member of the government, and especially I'm not ready speaking in this area on behalf of the government. Why? Because from the beginning, I was very skeptical regarding possibility and efficiency of the government policy in state-owned companies. And from beginning, I was convinced deeply that the best solution is minimize as such as possible state-owned sector, and to solve this problem by privatization, of course, transparent, open, professionally managed privatization. And then focus, of course, then we have to focus how to solve the problem in these minimum companies. After spending here now around 4 years, I'm even more convinced about the importance of this and about illusionary kind of plans that we can effectively manage state-owned companies. Let me give you a few figures which are, I think, very important, because finally, but I have to start by saying that in many areas it was done during the last 4 years a lot. Unfortunately, we are now speaking about area in which it was almost no. result. I agree with Mr. Pishny that yes, there are results, especially in banking sector, thanks to National Bank, new rules, supervision, and so on. Related party crediting and all these issues, increasing capital, this is really achievement. But speaking about results in or other state-owned companies, I'm afraid. Okay, we have few examples where the independent supervisory boards were established, but still privatization is not going on, which means this real solution is not. We have new law. Fortunately, now process was started, but we lost 4 years. Why it is important? Because by last decision of the government, it was passed this triage, which means how many companies will be privatized. It is only 9% of assets of the companies which are in triage, designated for privatization. At the same time, it is agreement here, and even those who are against privatization are saying yes, state-owned companies are a huge source of corruption, political clientelism, inefficiency, and so on. Which means, if we want to privatize only 9% of assets, then we are saying that we are doing a real solution of this problem only by very minor part, 9%. Because speaking about corporate governance principles, OECD for instance, it is nice. But it is necessary to know that this is potential problem everywhere. That the risk of inefficiency and not only corruption, but also corruption and inefficiency is simply higher. And then we are speaking about specific Ukrainian conditions, which are not only Ukrainians, which were in my country, and I'm speaking because my own experience. When I came to power, and I was in 4 governments, we quickly recognized that the really only solution is privatization. And we privatized what was possible to privatize as soon as possible. Because one of the problems is, and it is not possible to underestimate, that for functioning effectively, like in Scandinavian countries, OECD principles of corporate governance, you have to have very well functioning formal and informal rules. Rule of law, low corruption, very high standard of public administration, very long-term transparent environment. Don't forget that in Sweden, for instance, Freedom of Information Act was approved in 1773. 1773. Which means, I am convinced that yes. And then we have also a problem which exists also in publicly traded big companies, and it is from economic theory well-known principal-agent problem. It is information asymmetry and motivation asymmetry. Those who are running the company, especially if you are speaking about big companies, those people have much more information about those who are controlling them, either owners or representatives of state as owner, which means they have very information asymmetry, and also motivation is not the same. Those who are running this business and those who are owners or representative of owners. And if you are speaking about state ownership, of course, it is also even bigger problem, especially in conditions which are like they are in Ukraine. Which means, in my opinion, very important is, and then my answer to your question is that I really don't know. I really don't know, and because in principle, I'm supporter of limited government. And in principle, I don't think that it is good in principle to have to ask bank to fulfill some social functions. Why? I understand that in ATO there are conditions, or in small regions where commercially it will be not maybe done. But it is very easy to just outsource this, to just order on commercial basis from the state to commercial, fully privately owned banks to fulfill this. And you will have competitive conditions, you will take better conditions, I think, and you will not create problem of conflict of these functions in one state-owned bank. Because then it is easy to say or to apologize. Potentially, I'm not speaking about any concrete bank, but to say, okay, we didn't have such kind of profitability because we had to fulfill also these social functions and so on and so on. Which is speaking about banking sector, I don't see any reason to have state-owned banks. In Slovakia, we privatize all banks. In Estonia, they privatize all banks. And when financial crisis hit in 2008, 2009, we didn't have any problem with this. We didn't spend no euro, either nor in Estonia nor in Slovakia. On the contrary, Slovenia, which has still a lot of banking sector, but also other companies state-owned, they had a lot of problems. They had to spend a lot of money for covering, for sustaining these banks, and also corruption problem is there much higher in connection with these state-owned companies. Which means, very briefly, my strategy could be in this area to privatize what is possible privatize, and it's possible to privatize almost everything. But for Ukraine to have possibility to privatize much more, it will be necessary to restructure such companies like Naftogaz and Ukrzheleznica, to stay in the state ownership only what is natural monopoly. What is natural monopoly controlled by independent professional regulator and open market also for other private companies or other companies to use this natural monopoly and to create competition. And this is not theory. This is what we did in Poland, what we did in Slovakia, in other countries. Because without a restructuring and privatization of these companies and banking sector as well, you will have this situation that we have, which is very strange. Ukraine has 3,500 state-owned companies. About half are non-functioning, but still it is about 1,800. And when we tried to find some candidates for big privatization, so-called large privatization, which means big companies which can attract really strong strategic investors, we couldn't find 10. Finally, we found 5, but even this was the problem. Which means, sorry that I'm not speaking mostly about corporate governance of the state-owned companies, but this problem is very important. Because if we are concentrating, Ukraine has a lot of problems. It is necessary to concentrate on the most important decisions and most important reforms. And among most important reforms, I am fully 100% convinced is privatization, but not 9% of assets, but restructuring and privatization of the most important part of Ukrainian economy, which is still in state ownership. Banking sector, utilities, and other important companies.
In other words, you can bypass corporate governance processes if you privatize them. The private sector will take care of it by itself, and you don't have to go through the struggles.
Thank you for an opening and answer to my first question and also to the second question which I wanted to ask. Does Ukraine need to have a state-owned banks? But we'll discuss it. But just to make sure I understood, out of 3,000 state-owned companies, there are like 50 top, right? 50, So you think that it is doable in Ukraine to privatize 50 companies ASAP?
If we are speaking about assets or turnover, you can see that just few companies are creating 90%. And this is important, that but of course you cannot privatize, you can, but it is difficult to privatize Ukrzheleznica or Naftogaz as it is today, which means you have to restructure before, but they have to start. If this process will not start it now, when you will start? Which means, problem is that if we are speaking only about this, what is possible to privatize now, we are speaking about just not important part, which means we are speaking that we are not ready then to solve the problem of also inefficiency, corruption, bad management, and so on, so on. Because, in this, even if we will be able, and we know how it is going slowly and how difficult to create this independent supervisory board in big companies. It took 5 years and we have just few, yeah? But even if you are doing this problem of principal agent problem and even having potential of political interfering to these state-owned companies still is there. We are decreasing it if we have good supervisory board, but still it is not solving the problem. And it is not only about corporate governance, how it is managing. It is also about direct foreign investment, because investors are bringing not only new culture, new corporate governance, they're bringing also money, new investment, new markets, and so on, so on. Which means it is broader, and from more reasons it is important to start this process and to diminish state ownership in economy.
Okay. Thank you. To me, this discussion is, if we put the conclusions in writing, that will be the state ownership policy, because in fact, What it does, it answers the question what needs to be privatized, when and how, what needs to be liquidated. Like in Ukraine, this is another big area, and hopefully we'll get there, because it's quite difficult, challenging to impose good standards which are relevant for Ощадбанк, Укрзалізниця on companies which are not operating and which don't need to exist. So, and there are some companies, a lot, so which are dragging the progress, because it's, you can't make a law which will be relevant only for these specific companies, because, it just look bad. But then the social function, then the financing of the social function, and then what and how the companies which need to remain like national monopolies need to be managed. All of those questions are basically the bullet points of the draft of the state ownership policy, be it a document or just a discussion and conclusion and something existing in the minds or on the slides, doesn't matter the format. What matters is that it's identified, everyone, all the stakeholders are on the same page with respect to these questions, and there is a continuous process of renewal, update, and monitoring the implementation. Now when we come to implementation, what do you think, Катерина, що ви думаєте має бути зроблено?
What do you think needs to be done to implement the strategy for the state banks, which exists now? Well, let's assume there is the strategy that we need to privatize. We have the understanding what the preconditions are. So what needs to be done? And whether I understand it correctly, that the supervisory boards, which have to be formed according to the new law, their profile will be to prepare the state-owned banks for privatization process. I do hope you are right. Or maybe I am even sure it is right. Because, by the way, I'd like to have a short remark to support Miklos. My personal, I'm sure personally, and what we in fact discuss in the National Bank, that really privatization is a kind of medicine of bad corporate governance, because the private investor always takes care about all of the processes, maybe in a more efficient way. So if we speak about the state-owned banks precisely here, again, we have the understanding that the state, in fact for today, has to, well, we have such a target function. We have to take not more than 30% at the financial market. Today, this indicator is approximately 60% after the nationalization of Privat Bank. And it's understandable what we need to do with each of the banks. And about two of them, Privat Bank and Ukrgazbank, there are more or less precise roadmaps with predefined steps. So we have two more state-owned banks about which we need to conduct this work by the supervisory boards, which will be elected. Can we now rather quickly privatize the state-owned banks? The answer is no. And we can see it on the example of Ukrgazbank, which is the closest to the moment when it can change the owner, or at least to get an additional owner besides the state, because any private investor has certain requirements for the structure of the assets. It's not a secret if I tell you that the state monopolies for today are credited in the state banks. And for instance, as for Ukrgazbank, which elected the strategy of EcoBank, we can see certain wishes from the potential investor that its balance should be decreased or for the share of the state monopolies. So then there is a question: where should the state monopolies go if We want to privatize all of the state-owned banks, where they will be served, where they will take loans during the period when we do understand that the external markets are still not open for us. And our state monopolies, well, let's not hide that, they have some problem with the debts they have already. For instance, Ukrzaliznytsia, Ukrainian Railway, which pays to one bank and does not pay to the other, goes to the court to have certain credit contracts, court file, using the gaps in the legislation. So the issue is of the potential privatization of the state-owned banks is directly connected with the issue of the corporate governance of the state monopolies. Because the independent supervisory boards of those state monopolies have to define and to approve the strategic plans of their development, to understand the funding and debts which exist already, to define what's the target function, and to begin to move in the proper direction. Then those state monopolies will be able to go to the internal and external markets, having the strategy of development, long-term plans, financial plans including, business plans, to involve different loans and to have the competition conditions, and not only to use the only opportunity, the state-owned banks. And still it impacts again onto the implementation of the corporate governance and strategy in the state-owned banks. Because how can we say that the National Bank has developed several requirements, there are new regulations, we do understand how we implement, and the Ministry of Finance totally is at the same page with us, because we know what we'll do, but we cannot move on, because what the corporate governance of the state-owned property is. First of all, after the question why, what's the aim, it has to provide the equal competitive conditions for everyone. The state as a regulator is one thing, the state as an owner is a different thing. We're speaking about the state-owned banks which have historical legacy, they have the special separate conditions from the National Bank, because the state-owned enterprises are concentrated there, which violates certain regulations. So today, if we speak about equal opportunities, we need to use the sanctions. If we speak about the state point of view, understanding the consequences of the crisis, we're saying, okay, let us have those special conditions still, but please, independent supervisory boards of the big state monopolies, do something. For the 4 years, we are coming to the Ministry of Economic Development, we're communicating with them and suggesting, let's begin with Naftogaz and Ukrzaliznytsia. Let's together sit down at the table and look at the perspective, what can be done for us, not to prolong those waivers every year, but, dear people, for us to understand, let it be a 7-year, 10-year term, but let us approve that, and gradually will decrease the amount of active-passive operations in the state banks. What's the decree of the Cabinet of Ministers if we are saying that all of the state-owned enterprises are in the state-owned banks? Is it the competition? The answer is no. All of those are open questions. So when we're speaking about the state-owned banks, we need to understand the banking function is in fact a service. If the banking function it's a derivative of economy, you see? So if the main asset works in an improper way, the derivative cannot be proper. If in the main asset of the corporate guidance does not exist, the derivative will not exist. It is just the result. It would totally mirror all the drawbacks. So, of course, we need to define the priorities, and I totally support you that we need to define the objects we need to privatize, to do it as soon as possible, to prepare them. But simultaneously, we still need, maybe according to those enterprises, which the state, because of these or those reasons, has an intention to
Тому що
stay to
це ж не Україна
still to
придумала
be
у всьому світі є
state-owned,
державні підприємства, коли
because the
держава
whole world has
через них
state-owned
реалізує свою
enterprises.
функцію
When the state implements
соціальну,
its social function through those
забезпечуючи
enterprises,
суспільство.
providing the
Тому
society.
там треба працювати і вже
There
вчора
we need to work,
працювати
and
над
even we needed to work
корпоративним
yesterday
управлінням.
on the corporate guidance. Ms. Katerina will work on the guidance of the state-owned companies, and we do work on that. Shefki has heard the request.
Kind request to the board of Ukrainian Railways from the National Bank of Ukraine. І єдиний на панелі, хто
So the only person at the panel who never spoke whether Ukraine needs the state-owned banks and for how long is Mr. Andriy. So could you comment very short, please, because I do hope the audience has the questions already after we almost wrote the whole state policy of ownership. I will try to be as short as possible. In a nutshell, it seems to me that privatization is not a unique exercise. It has been coped by all of the countries of the European Union, of the Eastern Europe, and rather successfully. We need lots of things to analyze, what to watch. The only thing is, really, the state has defined about the further fate of the strategy of the development of banking sector as it is. So it defines how the functions will be distributed, or the commercial burden onto the banking sector will be distributed, knowing that the priority of the state exit out of the 100% shareholders' ownership is still there. As for the monopoly, well, you know, it's a very complicated topic for us, because you know that Ashad Bank has a very long history of relationship with the state-owned companies, and it has been diverse, rather different. We cannot say that the delay, and especially of the state monopolies, is zero. That's an efficient market of expiration. We want expiry of period, we want to work with it, and we have certain competency. This competency has been verified by our partners, even from the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, knowing that they have a very certain requirement for the volume of the state portfolio in the credit portfolio should decrease. We should diversify ourselves, and we are working actively on that, the small and medium business and the retail. But whether the competency on the work with the big corporate segment should stay, I'm sure it should stay. Yes, we really own this competency, and we want to develop it. Whether this cooperation between the state banks and the state monopoly creates certain non-market conditions, my answer is no, it does not. Because for today, the state monopolies engage the credits resources using the tender procedure. Look at Prozoro and look, just watch. The state and owned enterprises, Energo Rynok, has the Prozoro request, and you can see everything in the online mode. Why the standard procedures is not used by other banks with the Western capital, with the commercial capital? I've got a rhetorical question, so let it be open for the audience. We are working in this segment, we are working rather efficiently. The National Bank consciously and totally consequently going with certain waivers. And those waivers, which are historical, they are being decreased. I'd like to remind you one thing. Ashad Bank, of an example of 2014, had 20 billion of pre-term funding. The Ashad Bank of 2017, 0 loans of refunding. Everything came back. As for the issue of the social function, you know, it is a very painful topic for me. I wanted to share the monopoly with the commercial banking sector in the grey zone. You know, along the perimeter of the anti-terroristic operation. Why not? I don't see Raiffeisen there. I don't see Ukrsi Bank there. Where are you, dear colleagues? Let us work there. We are having the certain technology which can be given, and you can just look at that. Those are moving outlets, and they have really nicely equipped rooms where you can hide during the shelling, both the clients and the workers. The routes are working, the regulations. Just take it, use it. Where are you? So take this monopoly from us, please. So this is the situation. it is a bit controversial, I would say. If we're speaking about the privatization, yes. If we speak about that, it can't be happening just at an instant. We should think about that. One more thing I'd like to announce here about the Ukrainian post office, Ukrposhta. I do not understand the economic sense of this discussion around the creation of another state bank. Please deal with the 4 state-owned banks which exist already and then create another one. If we speak about the social function, let us work on collaboration first. We are ready. Our suggestions are on the table of all of the heads of Ukrainian Post Office since 2014. I personally signed several memorandums. If you don't like them, let's work together and develop some different ones. Let's not create one more bank. It's not needed for the work in the rural areas. For the social function, let's work on the technological issues. Let's work on the technologies of the teleserving. Let's work together and calculate and distribute the client flows. But all of that is work which we need to take. And the last issue. Who will have the responsibility on the preparation of privatization plan? My answer, the supervisory board. The formed supervisory board of highly qualified experts, 6 independent directors, 3 dependent ones. We will cooperate with them. But honestly speaking, I'm apologizing, but this is the zone of responsibility of the supervisory board. We have what to say, we have certain plans, but again, in this part, I really would like to have an opportunity as the head of the board to share the responsibility and to involve the experts which need to be in the supervisory board. I do hope for that so much. And there is nothing ironic in that. I'm totally sincere with you. Mr. Andriy, do not scare off the potential clients to the supervisory board with such a huge responsibility, because this is the second element you're mentioning. This will be the responsibility, that will be the responsibility. That's not true. Isn't that true? It's true. This is the discussion I'd like maybe to have a separate one, another round table, not this one. Let's speak about that, where the sphere of responsibility begins, where it ends. I'd like to add from my behalf that the responsibility zone of the supervisory board is written in the legislation and regulations, so we can debate about that. But okay, I do agree with Andriy, but there's nothing scary about that, honestly speaking. I would like to comment upon that about the Ukrainian Post Office, as this issue is, well, maybe since 2015 we are discussing it between ourselves, together with Ukrainian Post Office or separately. It seems to me it would be a nice idea, and this is an example how different ministries having similar structures do not see the forest behind the trees. Each of them develops its own separate strategy, but 2 teams or 3 teams cannot make a deal because each of them decided they want to be the leader of the market. So Ukrainian Post Office, when it came to the National Bank to get the bank license, it told, I've got some problems because I've got a social function on me. Again, not only Ощад Bank, but Ukrposhta has it too, and it's similar as far as I understand. But the banks with their cashless and technologies are taking my profits. That's why I need to become a bank. What would be nice to do to give Ukrainian Post Office to the Ministry of Finance, just to change the owner? Then maybe we'll solve this issue quicker and more efficient way. Mr. Andriy, we have a question from the audience. I do like the interactive character of our discussion, but I'd like to involve the audience now. I saw the question over there. We need the microphone, please.
I'm glad to see that the passion has not left Ukraine, so there is always enough passion about these discussions. But let me take a step back from the heat of the moment. I'm fully with Ivan to say that the corporate governance compliance at the state companies will always be more difficult, because these companies will always be political, at least more political than the private sector. Let me make 2 specific proposals how to perhaps reduce the political aspect of it. Number 1, to nominate members to the boards of the state enterprises, I think there has to be a separate independent nomination committee indeed, the relevant minister in the end would need to sign off, but I would not give the minister the right to come up with candidates. Perhaps to have a veto is okay, but then the minister needs to argue with the committee, and the committee should contain private sector people, academia, and perhaps some civil servants, but not politically driven people, technocrats rather than politicians.
Andre,
That's
we have that
proposal number
already. We already have that functioning.
So that's fantastic. Now, proposal number 2, at the state enterprises, I think you should also have a scorecard and KPI that is similar to private sector and that is not being mingled based on, specific wishes or specific times and years. Thank you.
Thank you. Ivan, you wanted to...
Small reaction, not on this, because I agree, but what Mrs. Roshkova said in connection what was said now, because this is very important. I understand that situation is difficult. I understand that state-owned banks are dealing especially with state monopolies, which have all debts and so on and so on, but what we are speaking about is that we have part of economy which is working on soft budgetary constraints. And we have to solve this as soon as possible to solve this, because if we will not solve this, then for what you will have nice independent professional members of supervisory board? What kind of KPI will you have? How it will be competition with the normal sector, which is working in hard budgetary constraints? Which means I understand that situation is very, very difficult. It was also in my country. In 1999, we started this process. What we did, we simply cleaned banking sector. 3 biggest state-owned banks, it costed 12% of GDP. It was unbelievably expensive. We imposed bankruptcy law, which means we imposed hard budgetary constraint to both of these sectors. And then we simply privatized it, which means we started in 1999. It was the similar situation like here in Ukraine. In 2001, 2002, these banks were restructured, privatized, new bankruptcy law, hard budgetary constraints, and it works. Which means I know the situation is difficult. I'm just saying that we lost 4 years. And it is impossible to lose another 5 years. It is necessary to start as soon as possible to solve this problem. Because if we will argue that, yeah, it is impossible because this all debt which was inherited and so budgetary, then we will never solve the problem.
And if I may add to that, I think the issue of getting out of this vicious cycle of who's going to finance state-owned enterprises if you don't have state-owned banks can be broken only by making state-owned enterprises financially strong and independent. So gradually, it's not a from one day to next solution, but as you bring these enterprises to be credible institutions, not only then state-owned banks, other institutions will start looking at them more interestingly, but also in the process of selling of some stakes in the state-owned banks, that will not be seen as a sort of a stone around the neck of state-owned banks. So you have to start from where the problem is, and the problem really is state-owned enterprises have not been run for the purposes of being commercially viable enterprises, and we need to resolve that issue.
All right. Andrei, you had a question?
Can I give a small comment as well? A very short comment. My name is Andrei Boitsun. I work on the advisory team of the cabinet, which is led by Ivan Miklos. And I hold a PhD in corporate governance, so I would be tempted to promote it as much as possible. But in the past 3 years in Ukraine, I've come to realize the limitations of that intervention. And compared to privatization, it is always a second best solution. There are 2 situations in which it is necessary. One is when the state has to perform a certain, let's call it a social function, through owning a company. And the other one is when the road to privatization, like in case of Oshchad Bank, is going through a stop called corporate governance reform. But another more important limitation is that, and I think I will address this question to Shevki in his rare capacity as a Turk, and refer to the recent example of President Erdogan appointing himself the head of the State Property Fund of Turkey.
And his son-in-law as his chairman, vice chairman.
Yeah, so that's a risk that we have not been contemplating so far. So what do you think about that?
Okay, I think, and in the discussions we've been having over the past 4 or 5 years, I personally am opposed to creating a super monster that collects all the assets of the state. Because when you create such superpower, all the people who are seeking to create runt will focus one way or another and achieve through variety of means influence, if not to say control, over the way in which the superstructure then will work. So in trying to resolve the issue of how to more effectively manage the state ownership, you can be shooting yourself in the foot if you created the superstructure. I think what is important is the salami method. You know, you have to divide the problem into manageable bits, and the manageable bits would be for each enterprise, each key enterprise, to develop this famous state ownership policy that is subscribed by a broader community of stakeholders, and then you delegate the implementation of the plans and the strategy to realize that state ownership objectives to the independent, competent board. If you create, a la Erdogan, $300 billion thing, and put yourself and your son-in-law in the executive management, you report to yourself, fantastic thing, but I don't think it works.
Lean structure, no? Пане Андрію, ви хотіли відкоментувати?
Mr. Andriy, would you like to comment upon that? Yes, a short comment. I totally agree with what was mentioned, that we shouldn't wait for privatization or the creation of supervisory board. We should reform and modernize now, because we are getting wages for that now. To prepare the bank and to do whatever we can do. At the example of Oshad Bank, we were not waiting for the change of the corporate governance system. We understood that sooner or later it will take place. We cannot avoid that, and we shouldn't. In 2014, we began a very precise analysis of the corporate guidance which creates the system of risk management in the whole Europe, and to implement it into the system of the governance of the bank, where it can be done by the board. We began it with the veto right and the risk management department. Of course, this veto totally escalates the issue on the level of the supervisory board. This is the first point. Secondly, we had some other points, of course. I will not list them. As for the social status, a very short illustration for you to understand what we're speaking about. Slovyansk liberation. 48 hours passed, and a Shadbank outlet renewed its activities there after the liberation, and the pensions went there. The country came back there. Ukrainian authorities came back. The status came back there. We came there together with the Minister of Interior, the head of Ukrainian Automobile Commission, and the head of Ukrainian Railways. And the third point, the state status is very expensive. Oshadbank has lost, because of the annexation of Crimea, in an instant 24 billion hryvnia of the assets which we had in the Crimea. If the rest commercial banks in this or that way could mitigate or minimize their losses, I will not mention about that, because you know how it was done. We could not do that. Everything, up till the last penny, was taken. We left everything there, and we went to the International Commercial Arbitrage, the first Ukrainian state-owned company which had the full procedure of the International Commercial Arbitrage Court, and now we are a step ahead, and we try to have the solution which I hope will be positive. There is a question here.
Yes, Ina Petrashko, INTLFC Stone. My question is to Katerina, if I may. In one of your comments, you did mention that one of the reasons of slower privatizations and one of the problems that currently exist in Ukraine is the fact that international markets are closed.
It's fact of what, sorry?
International markets are closed.
So I'd like to come from the other side. Our company holds an FCA license which is equal to investment bank. We are not a bank though. We did attempt multiple times to discuss with banks and other financial organizations in Ukraine to do business, And the answer was, because we are not a bank, we cannot do business with you, even though we do like what you offer. So my question is, are there any attempts or maybe already some work towards working in changing the regulations, or maybe even further, like a mutual recognition of the rules and regulation between Europe and Ukraine? Thank you.
Дивіться, перше я
Well, look, first of
коли
all,
говорила про
when I spoke about
зовнішні ринки,
the external
я не говорю,
markets,
що вони
I was not
закриті.
speaking they're
Я говорю
closed.
про
No.
те, що сьогодні
I said that
наші компанії,
our companies,
українські,
Ukrainian
не
companies,
мають такого
do not have
вільного туди
such a
доступу
free
в силу
access to it
цілого ряду
because of
обставин,
lots of different
включаючи як наші
conditions,
внутрішні,
including our
так і певні
internal
зміни
conditions and
і
certain
ситуації, яка
changes and
відбувається на
situation which
зовнішніх
is
ринках,
taking place at the
особливо
external markets,
щодо
especially as
зацікавленості
for the
інвесторів
interest
в
of the
ринках
investors
країн
in the
або
markets
в інвестиціях країни, що
or
розвиваються.
investments of the
Тому це
developing
вони не
countries.
закриті,
They
але
are not closed,
це, скажімо так,
but I'd
можливості
say
вільного
those are
доступу
opportunities of
дещо
free
обмежені. Це
access
перше.
which are rather restricted.
Друге, що стосовно
Secondly, as for
потенційної
the
можливості
potential
змінити
opportunity to change the
Дивіться,
regulations.
за останні
Look, during the last
3 чи 4 роки
3 or 4 years,
Національний банк,
the National Bank,
ну, мені здається,
it
зробив
seems to
величезну
me, has
роботу,
conducted a
яка
huge job,
зазвичай вона знаходиться
which is
поза,
mostly
ну,
beyond.
вона не є на перших шпальтах,
Well, it's not
про
on the
це не
first
пишуть
pages of the
кожного дня,
newspapers, it's
але ми
not
дуже
written in
багато
the
уваги
media every day,
приділяємо
but we pay lots of attention to
дерегуляції,
deregulation,
зміни наших
the changes of our
регуляцій і
regulations
адаптації
and
до нових
adjustments
бізнес-умов,
towards the new
аби
business
спростити
conditions, to
розвиток
simplify
бізнесу,
the development of business,
притік інвестицій,
the
таке інше.
flow of
Тому моя відповідь
flow
буде так.
of the
Це
investments.
можливо,
So I would
проте
answer,
про це
it
треба
is
говорити
possible,
конкретніше,
but we need
можливо,
to
не на
speak
таку
more
широку
precise,
аудиторію,
maybe
треба
not with such a
зрозуміти,
wide audience, because we need to
детальніше
understand
кейс,
the
і
detailed
тоді,
case,
про це
and
говорити.
then
Якщо
we
це
can speak
дійсно
about that.
є
If
якісь
it's
такі
really
перешкоди,
a kind of an
які,
obstacle
скажімо,
which
не є принциповими
is not
з
that
точки зору
principle
регулювання ринку
from
в
the
цілому,
point of
проте
view of the market
перешкоджають
regulation,
входженню
but
нових
still interferes
гравців
into the new
або
players
розвитку
emerging
якихось нових послуг
or
або
the
нових
development of new
напрямків, то,
services,
звичайно, ми готові
then of
подивитися
course
і
we are ready
змінити.
to look
Ми
at
вже
that and
дуже
to
багато
change that.
змінили,
We've
і
changed a lot
не тільки
already,
на
and
банківському
not
ринку,
only at
але
the
й на інших
banking
суміжних,
sector, but
де ми
other
є
similar sectors
регулятором
where we are the
другої руки,
regulator
так би
of,
мовити, тому
so
це
to
є
say,
послуги, які ми
second
ліцензуємо,
term.
і їх не надають
So
банки.
we are
Тому ми
licensing
готові
some of the
до
services.
змін, тому що все,
We
що
are
ми
ready
робимо,
for the changes because
тільки для
everything
того,
what
аби
we do
країна була
is
більш
created for our
привабливою
country to be
для
more
інвесторів,
attractive
для
for the
інвестицій,
investors, for the
і
investments,
щоб економіка зростала.
and for the economy growth. Thank you. Are there any other questions left? Yes, please. Dmytro Shimkiv.
Because in general, we have a lot of discussion over the last years in Ukraine about abolishing completely state-owned enterprises, as eliminated as a concept. But as Andriy already mentioned, somebody has to serve on freed territories. Somebody has to deliver posts to the villages where there is no profitability. Somebody has to offer a credit or financial resources to strike a General Electric deal, because all other banks were not capable. I understand there could be a competition, but it will increase significantly costs for the state. So if we eliminate the function of the state-owned enterprises, which is cheap for the state, who can perform this function? Oh, and will there be companies willing to perform function not generating any revenue?
Yeah, firstly, I spoke about banks, that I don't see any reason to have commercial state-owned banks, which doesn't mean that no state-owned companies. Of course, especially in natural monopoly, it is better to have state-owned natural monopoly than private state-owned monopoly. And of course, then there are some specific areas, like maybe military, maybe some military research that could be, but it is exceptional. In my opinion, there are different opinions. Some people are saying, oh, it has to be much more. My opinion is that it is very limited where really it is necessary to have. Regarding these functions, even this, it is calling public interest service, which is possible. It is possible that if state want to do something, for instance, this post service, also in the areas which are remote, which is more costly, state can order this. State can order this, and if it will be ordered by competition, by private companies, I'm sure that you have better chance that it will be cheaper than if it is doing one company which has monopoly for this. But it is possible. It is not theory, it is works like that in some countries, just in some countries. But also speaking about banks, yeah, we have in Slovakia, we have some special banks, but they have special kind of goal. We have credit, small bank which is giving some support for a small business, yeah? But it is special, it is not general commercial bank. We have Exim Bank, which has specific, and they are state-owned, but not fully fledged commercial banks. There is no reason for it, in my opinion, and this, again, not every, many countries. Even we don't have, when we started, when we did this privatization, we didn't have any one Slovak privately owned bank. All commercial banks in Slovakia have been foreign owned. Now we have in first 10, 7, 8 and 9 biggest banks, which means not the biggest, are private owned, which have been developed from nothing, yeah? Which means in this area, I'm really convinced that you don't need. Principle is important, and it's the same principle. It is every government has to have social policy. Okay, let's say like that. But it doesn't. But the worst case how to do this is by deforming market. For instance, by deforming price, which means regulate the gas price is the worst possible way how to do social policy. Much better is to have market price, market conditions, and then to subsidize those who need help, which means not on the side of revenues, but on the side of expenditures. And this logic, in my opinion, is possible solve also in these social functions which government has to have. Nothing against. It is clear that government has to have, especially these occupied territories, especially also these remote areas and so on and so on.
Thank you. If I may add, Shevki, may I go first? Okay. I think, Dmitry, the price for state getting these functions from state-owned banks now is a bit calculated erroneously, because it's not just they're just not paying now for that. Yeah. And if you have, OECD-style governance of state-owned enterprises and banks, you are supposed to, let's say, not necessarily compensate it from the budget, but identify the social functions and find the ways to finance it. And then you'll know the real price.
Yeah, I think. But there's one point here, that the fact that these services have to be provided on non-economical terms, it means, as you said, somebody is paying for it already. So it's a question of making the payment process transparent by identifying, and try to save on that cost by finding the most efficient deliverer of that service through competition. I mean, that is one way of dealing with it. In all, it is not possible to do such, concrete quantification in all areas, but to the extent, if you adopt this as a philosophy, that you will try to, in a very transparent way, articulate the cost and ask for bidders, like anything else, that for a competitive process, you will save cost. The second thing I wanted to say is often, there's complaint and I don't have my independent board, so I cannot perform well, and I'm, therefore I'm influenced by the politicians and everybody else. But the thing I think Andrei, with its partnership with EBRD, is doing is an example that you first, within your institution, set up the right structures of governance, accountability, transparency, and orient your institution towards decision-making with those structures. Easier it is then to defend the position, to ask for this extra layer of governance structure of independent board.
Thank you. Пане Андрію, ви хотіли відкоментувати?
Well, in fact, there are two aspects if we speak about the anti-terroristic operation zone, or as it's called now, joint forces operation. Two aspects. The first one, nothing interferes to 1, 2, or 10 companies to come to the gray zone and to serve it. Why aren't they coming? There are clients there. They're paying the commission. I will tell you more. I was really happy to read the statistics. And when there is an opportunity, I'm always speaking about that. When our moving vehicles which are working at the block posts, people are bringing deposits to the Ukrainian National Bank, and they are bringing it from the territory which is not under control of Ukraine. And they do that in those two little windows of those trucks. This is the sense of the commercial mission. And this part of the exercise is conducted where we can earn and compensate, we earn and compensate. Secondly, this is the issue of safety. The issue of safety and security of the employees and funds, and we have developed it actively. It seems to me it is rather, we have a very active system of cooperation and the issue of national security, because the zone of joint forces operation is the zone where there is the war with our guys. They're getting the salary there. They get certain compensations. There is their personal data there, transaction history there. The country is in fact, at the war aggression state. The lists of the military men and women demobilized, the addresses of their relatives, and so on. I will not tell you how we are doing that, but I must tell you that it can be done not by all of the banks, taking into account certain precise restrictions. So in this part, the function of the state-owned banks is not under doubts. Undoubtedly, everybody would like to serve the refugees, 1,600,000 of the client base, but somehow they want to take refugees in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odesa. Why don't they serve them in Bakhmut? Why do you re-register them at the confrontation line and delimitation line? There are certain points, and with the Ministry of Finance we have an efficient dialogue that we need this client flow to compensate the losses. So this dialogue is a permanent one, and today, performing this social function, we're trying to find this point of balance between our social function and the expenses which the bank bears, performing all the requirements of the National Bank. Thank you for your attention. Thank you. Yes, please, the last question now. Dmitro Kuzmin, I've got the question to Andriy and to all of the panelists. Andriy has mentioned the question of the supervisory boards and an opportunity to delegate the part of the responsibility to the supervisory board, especially as for the troubled loans, which are the biggest part of the state-owned banks. In my understanding, the new supervisory board and those experts will provide those new troubled debts not to emerge again. So as far as I understand, for an efficient work with them, the state banks have to operate as private banks. They need to restructure as for the law enforcement. So my question is, what are the tools which can be used to have an opportunity to restructure, to operate more as a private bank? And to what extent you could operate as a private bank? But of course, could be your own opinion. Two aspects, if I understood you correctly. First of all, the supervisory boards which will be formed, at which will gain the authorities to deal with the troubled debts. This is more of looking forward, not to have more of troubled debts, but what we should do with the past ones. And secondly, to solve the issue with the problem troubled debts, could you use the tools which the private banks are using? And how can you get them? I will begin with the second one. Unfortunately, we cannot use those mechanisms and those mechanisms of indulgence or debt release, which are done by the private banks, will again meet the guests from the law enforcement if we do that, unfortunately. This is the conclusions of our lawyers, and this is the practice which has been conducted during the last 4 years about the criminal cases which are being investigated, the violations and so on. So we're using today the unified mechanisms, which is the Kyiv approach for the restructuring of debt, which foresees the involvement of the experts, independent experts and auditors, assessors, which gives them maximum openness for the process and the substantiation of the solutions and conclusions. precise conclusions as for the impact onto the regulations of the bank and the calculation of the two alternative scenarios. What could happen if we hadn't restructured anything, and what would happen if we had conducted the restructuring? If the independent experts adopts the economic efficiency of the option which foresees restructuring of the asset with the positive economic effect, then undoubtedly we will look at that and then we'll structure the contracts. As for the other question, to give the part of to delegate the responsibility to the supervisory board, well, you know, in fact, all of those decisions, no, I will begin differently. So, during the process of the checks, which we had conducted during the last 4 years in Oshad-Bank, the conclusions included the formulation that the board of Oshad-Bank has been delegated with lots of authorities, but it has used it for modernization and reforms of the bank. There were no abuse and violations. It's true, we were delegated lots of authorities, and the board has done a lot thanks to that. I consider that was a push forward as for modernization and reforms. But as for the issue of toxic portfolio, then here, you know, we would like to share this responsibility and maybe the qualification, to involve additional qualification, because, you know, those are really complicated cases, both as for their volume and about their interests, conflicts of interests, and possible consequences. So we would like for this qualified supervisory board to be involved in this process. Moreover, it's their direct function, how to avoid the troubled debts portfolio. So the credit policy is also the authority of supervisory board. I will try to be short to add, look, the use by the state banks of the same toolkit which is used by the commercial banks in the process of restructuring has never been banned by the law. So it's more the question for our law enforcement, because whatever we do, it's always a bad thing. So Dmitry, during the previous panel discussion, said the nice thing, that transparency is the best medicine for the people who see corruption everywhere. The Kyiv approach is a very transparent ground, and the transparent procedure, which is a public one. This is the first one, the protection for the state-owned banks, for the management which takes decisions. Secondly, I do hope there will see independent supervisory boards. And the third, we do understand this issue, and not only that we need to restructure, to clean the balance and to let people work more, but it's needed for the economy, because those enterprises are working. They need the cash flow, but they cannot get it because it's in the legacy. So we have such a ground, which is called the Council of the Financial Sustainability, where we, together with the Ministry of Finance, came to the conclusion to create an additional ground which would consider the issues of restructuring of troubled debts in the state-owned banks and to give certain recommendations. And again, it's transparency, this is the teamwork on the decision-making process, and 100% the banks can be calm and quiet, because this is again the protection for them as for the possible accusations of certain violations. Thank you. I think that we should conclude, though. Of course, we could go on with this discussion not only in here, but our time is up, so we would like to breathe fresh air. So for me, these are the issues and some of the answers which need to be at the state policy of state ownership. But what's important, as for me, thanks to this discussion, we understood that the existing strategy of the state-owned banks is an important document, and obviously where it's heading for, but it's not a 100% similarity of the state-owned policy, because the issue of social function is still debatable. The second point, the reform of the state-owned banks and enterprises were simultaneous or parallel in the majority of cases. But out of what I hear, it's time, finally, and we have a request to unite them, because we have the understanding that the conduction of the development strategy of the state banks without the increase of the level of corporate governance in the monopolies, or without the definition what's going on with the strategy of the governance on the state-owned enterprises, would be either complicated or impossible. So now I hope that when the law is adopted on the state-owned banks, the whole team, both of the Ministry of Finance and the National Bank and the state-owned banks, will join the work on the promotion of the law on the increase of corporate governance in the state-owned companies, and join the work on the overall state ownership policy for the whole sector, which would include and answer all the questions about those interconnections. So when you privatize the state-owned banks, how you fund the state-owned enterprises and perform the social functions which we discussed here. I thank you so much for your attention, and I do invite you to have further discussions. Thank you.
And, you know, what BIS does is sort of like highlight risk more than we highlight what's going well. So maybe I will highlight more of the risks, but it doesn't mean that the situation is particularly bleak. So, you know, like last year, we had a very forgiving global liquidity environment, and Ukraine, just as other emerging markets, enjoyed very easy funding conditions, and it placed a 15-year bond. Also, beginning of this year, investors were quite overweight Ukraine. The currency was one of the best performing currencies in the first half of the year. I think hryvnia appreciated something like 7%, maybe more. And that was kind of a general theme for actually most emerging markets. But since a few months ago, it was obvious the situation has changed. The Goldilocks is sort of, that environment has come to an end. And, you know, maybe some of the complacency that had set in among some in the political circles in Ukraine, that these easy funding conditions are going to continue for a long time, and we can maybe even avoid relying on IMF. But it's going to be challenging going forward because the risks for emerging market funding are skewed to the downside. I mean, you have U.S. monetary policy tightening. You also have U.S. fiscal expansion in such a late cycle of monetary policy, which also de facto raised short-term interest rates in the U.S. and further tightened funding conditions globally. You have this bizarre situation where, on the one hand, we have oil prices rising, but then we also had U.S. dollar strengthening. Again, that presents a challenge for emerging markets dependent on external funding. Yeah, finally, trade and political uncertainty doesn't help emerging markets and Ukraine as well. So maybe I just say one more thing specific to Ukraine. You know, in terms of external funding, most other emerging markets by now are kind of moved beyond original sin, and the governments have been able to issue local currency bonds and place it with international investors. So far, Ukrainian government relies primarily on foreign currency debt, and a lot of it is short term. And at the moment, short-term funding has been secured from the IMF. Also, as a fallback option, Ukrainian banking system itself has quite a bit of FX deposits interbank, and those can be invested in Ukrainian government paper to keep rolling over the short-term debt. But over a longer run, the focus must be on the kind of changes that will bring in stable long-term funding, FDI, foreign currency capital inflows, and that brings us back to really bringing your house in order. Ukraine must proceed with land reform, privatization, agricultural reform, and this then means that even though external funding is a very important source, what will bring stable external funding is bringing one's house in order. In addition to that, it's very important to have solid domestic macroeconomic institutions, develop domestic financial markets, and domestic regulatory environment. I mean, these are not my original thoughts. This is just what IMF prescribes as the first best in terms of attracting the most stable capital inflows. For example, just to give you one example of the kind of markets that Ukraine may need, at the moment, it's very difficult to induce domestic financial institutions in Ukraine to buy local currency hryvnia government paper. Well, why is that? That's because Ukrainian banks, private banks, rely quite a bit on foreign currency funding, because of the lack of derivative markets to hedge that funding, they have to match it directly with foreign currency bonds and other foreign currency assets. If Ukraine were to develop a robust market for hedging instruments, among other things for currency risk, it will also help develop local currency bond market so that to reduce government's reliance on solely on external investors. Maybe I'll just take a pause here.
Sure. Can I a quick follow-up? Do you think there was an alternative to the IMF? Could Ukraine have survived through elections without the IMF?
I think it could probably, so there's about maybe 3 billion or so FX deposits that Ukrainian banks can put to use to refinance, also roll over Ukrainian government debt. And, you know, that would only cover maybe 6 months or so of the maturing debt next year. So my answer is no. I think this is absolutely necessary to have IMF on board at this stage, also because it forces the Ukrainian authority to follow through with the structural reform, which actually in itself will ensure the more stable form of funding and investor confidence going forward.
Okay, Joe, just to be clear, we're not there yet with the IMF. Not quite. I could perhaps interrogate Vladimir around that, but I won't just yet. So, but I'll answer the question. I mean, you know, National Bank of Ukraine, I mean, I think Governor Shmoley and the team at the National Bank have excelled themselves. And one area particularly is in terms of monetary policy. I mean, you've proven when many central banks, I can think of Central Bank of Turkey that has had a torrid time because of its orthodoxy. I mean, you guys have been brutally orthodox. I mean, and you know, I commend you enormously from that. But in terms of the mix between external pressures and how you view the world in terms of your monetary policy decision, and then the domestic challenges, could you perhaps talk about the two and their interplay between the two and your decisions that you've taken so far that, again, I would commend, maybe others wouldn't, in terms of you live here perhaps, but...
In terms of monetary policy, I could say that it's really... It's okay now? Oh, okay. So it's really challenge to deserve credibility as inflation targeting central bank. So actually currently the inflation expectations are above our targets, and fundamental inflation pressure is stubbornly high. It's you could see it on high level of core inflation, and because of that we need to have a tight monetary policy. And if you take it in terms of like neutral policy rate, under our estimation is about 2.5% plus expectations of, let's say, market analysts about 8%. So it gives us neutral nominal interest rate at about 10-11%. So all that above is just because we need to bring inflation to the target, and we're determined to do it. And of course, the situation is challenging, but usually experts see our high debt repayments next year's as a challenge, but I see that it's an opportunity because our politicians do not have a lot of space to maneuver, and actually that makes them like fans of orthodox policy. So I think it will be, there is no other way just to reform, to go on with reforms, to have credible macro policy. And on the side of the National Bank, I could say that there is high, very unpredictable environment. But the job of the central bank is to create predictability by doing its job, by making predictable policy. And that's what we are trying to build. And actually we need to distinguish by fighting these very unpredictable environment, we are making credible policy framework, which is inflation targeting. And some experts are actually mixed up with these terms like policy framework and policy action. It's not like substitutes. We need to distinguish them. Policy framework, it's the durable and consistent framework of doing things, and it consists goals, commitments, and all this stuff which is consists monetary policy itself. And there was a proposals like when National Bank of Ukraine admitted that we are not gonna hit the inflation target this year just to increase the target for inflation. It's wrong. It's like a wrong idea, because you should not change your policy framework when you have a challenge. You need to have policy action. And actually what we have done, we are increasing our policy rate as a response to this challenge. So you need to adhere to your framework and to be consistent, and at the end you will get a result, and we will hit the target, and I think we will bring inflation to the target range next year, which is 5 ± 1 percentage point.
I mean, can I ask you anyway? I mean, what is the latest position with the IMF? You may not want to comment, but what is the official line of the National Bank and the government in terms of the state of play?
Yes, we're still waiting for the mission, the press release of the mission, but our view is consistent, and we think that we need to have IMF on board anyway. So it's we need to have a program for these years of very large repayments, so it will be optimal policy to minimize cost of this and to minimize risks for the next years.
Okay, apologies to put you on the spot there. I think we all know the National Bank position with respect to the IMF programme. Michaela, can I ask you, I mean, I see you, you know, can I ask you your picture, your macro forecast for the year ahead, how you see Ukraine kind of developing through elections, perhaps, and out the other side? I mean, what have you got in terms of growth, inflation, so current account, fiscal position? I mean, what are your sort of assumptions for the year ahead?
Well, as you mentioned, I see you organizes this kind of events, and I believe now is the best time to start planning the next year. What will be talking next year? Will we say about the previous 12 months whether it was a lost year? Whether or not it was lost year, because with the current amount of uncertainty, our base case scenario is that Ukraine gets the IMF deal done, gets all the other fundings. NBU stands rock solid as it is, or the monetary policy, which in my opinion means that the rates stay stable for the next, I don't know, 5, 6, maybe a month or so, and somewhere in the middle of 2018 we might see a start of a cycle of rates decrease. Yes, maybe NBU has a different story, but that's how it looks. But now with the development story, with the postponements of tariffs hike, this amount of uncertainty is basically erode the base scenario to some point. There is some correlation that people who are outside the country usually sees everything in much more optimistic way, while people who actually live in the country, they always are a bit skeptical of all the improvements. So basically, our forecast for GDP is below 3%. So basically, no VRI holders will not get anything in 2021.
Really? Down?
Yeah, it's a pity. Well, but you can account for maybe capital gain if everything's going on. But on the previous panels, we've talked a lot about politics, much more than we used to on our previous year forums, and it's a logical thing to do, because with those polls that nobody can actually read and understand who's going to be president and which policy will be there. And in my view, that reforms, albeit they've been everything that's been done in Ukraine is solid. They are reversible, and they can be reversible very quickly. And this is the risk number one for all the projections that we are making.
Thank you. I'm in a wonderful position that, again, I'm a buy-side guy, and I've got two sell-side analysts on the panel, and I'm their client, and they have to answer every question I ask them. So they're in the hot seat. So I've been really dying to ask this question, which is basically, as a foreigner, looking into Ukraine, I'm trying to figure out, and people don't seem to want to ask it in Ukraine for some reason, but if I look at the different politicians vying likely to be president, I mean, can you just describe the main differences in terms of policy? I mean, you're obviously reading the press and the newspapers, and you're trying to figure out, I guess Poroshenko is clear. You'd probably think we've had a period of office, but then there are the other contenders. So you've got obviously Tymoshenko, Gritsenko, maybe Vakachuk if he decides to stand or whatever. But the other people who are likely to be in a position to challenge Poroshenko, I guess, in the presidential election, I mean, what is the real difference in terms of policy? And if any of those emerges as victorious in the presidential election, I mean, how would policy likely to change? Do you see a big difference in terms of policy with the different presidential contenders, either of you?
Well, it was for me or not?
I wasn't asking you. That's not allowed.
That's for me.
No, it's fine. Sure.
Okay. I don't know. Just quick remark. The P word we've been using here a lot, this populist. In my view, the populist...
Say Poroshenko there, the P word.
No, I mean, populist very often cease to be populist when they are in the government. So Greece is the good example. Well, not. It's hard to put Greece and good in one sentence, but I managed to. But yes, this is the Plan B scenario. I believe that Ukraine can survive even without IMF, even without the populist government, because it's turned out to be strong. But it's probably a B scenario.
Okay. Alexander or Alina, whichever one would like to answer.
Hello. Yeah, okay. So the question is whether...
Is there much difference in terms of economic policy between the main contenders? I mean, do you imagine a really big difference after the election?
Well, in terms of, first of all, like a quick comment on elections, I just heard it. It's also not my original thought, but I thought of one political analyst which I respect. One key peculiarity of the elections that we're going to face next year is that it's first time, like for a long time, Ukraine didn't have such a situation where we would have more than 2 or 3 key, most likely, like winners, say in the presidential race, right? So currently, at least 5 people are very realistic candidates, given that we will likely to face second round based on the polls, right? Low popularity of almost equal low popularity of key candidates means that there is much wider range of opportunities, and of course wider range of political, so economic foreign policy. On foreign policy, right, most of the candidates are void, at least they speak being pro-Western, and that reflects currently the overwhelming preferences of Ukraine population. The actual foreign policy which they will deliver might diverge from that or not, but currently, apart from several more pro-Russian politicians, right, the majority sounds pro-Western. In terms of the economic policy, of course, the opposition, it's very natural for the opposition to sound populist, and we have several candidates who voice the ideas which population likes, that is increasing pensions, cancelling pension reform, cutting gas tariffs, etc. That sounds worrying to us on the sell side, but also to the investors, because this all is not compatible with the IMF cooperation, hence not compatible with Ukraine paying on its debts, and this would mean more macro volatility if that's implemented. Here I would add that it's not clear whether populist politicians remain populist when they are in power, because like being in opposition and being in power, these are two different things. Как говорят в Одессе, две большие разницы. So it seems like as majority population preferences are accounted for, it seems there is no alternative to the West. And on the previous panel, and here you asked whether there is an alternative to the IMF. Maybe this is the case that whoever comes in power, there is really no alternative to the IMF. I think there is always an alternative, but that's a big question whether you want to live in that alternative, right? So it would be much better if Ukraine preserves, if National Bank of Ukraine preserves independence and Ukraine meets its obligations. It just all other scenarios outside of the IMF are very bumpy. I think I have been answering the question for several minutes. I managed to avoid any names, not to breach any compliance rules, and be punished when back to London. So I'll give the word.
Actually, Alexander, can I ask slightly different? I mean, the fact that perhaps the IMF program has been moved from an extended financing facility to an SBA standby arrangement. I mean, I assume that is what is going to happen, right? I mean, all the leaks suggest that, right? And it's been sold as, taking Ukraine through the election cycle and reassuring guys like me, right? I mean, that's the message, because Ukraine wants to come to market.
Yeah.
So, Alexander, should I be reassured that the fact that there's a program, there's going to be a standby arrangement? Oh, sorry, Vlad. Sorry, my mistake. Vladimir, sorry. Should I be assured by the fact there's a standby arrangement in place that whatever happens in terms of the election, the reform kind of agenda will remain more or less in place?
Well, speaking of IMF, likelihood of IMF and the whole idea of the second IMF program, just right instead of DCFF, I think is logical. I think it's actually a pretty good idea, and I think it's feasible. It makes the whole, I think, progress with the SBA feasible, rather than kind of waiting through the elections and doing the EFF afterwards. But again, speaking of the kind of correlation between the IMF and the elections, I can answer the previous question. I also try to avoid naming any specific names. But I think this idea of politics doesn't really matter in the long term. I think I do like this idea, and I think it is the case. So eventually, of course, all reforms will be done and things will be great in the long term. But to get to this point long term, I think basically from the market perspective, at least, and we are sell-side people, buy-side, I think that's what's the most important. From the market perspective, the timing does matter, and the timing could be quite critical. So yes, we could survive. It'll probably, the country in general will be okay from the market perspective as long as SBA is around, but whoever comes on top after the elections, then of course I think it will still be important one way or another. I just wouldn't be overly complacent about that, even if the IMF will still be around. But because afterwards we will still need another program probably in 2020 going forward, right? Or maybe at least create additional framework of how to manage to deal with all these maturities going forward. This, I guess, for negotiations of yet a new program afterwards, so we could have completely different starting points. If it's going to be the current government or the people who sound like the current government or the completely different people, in the end, in the long term, I do think that we all converge to, because the country cannot kind of survive and all, there's lots of pressures and all, and in the end, we'll probably converge to this IMF type scenario. So all these reforms will be done, the national bank will be fully independent and tight and all that. But basically the question is like whether or not between now and then, this perfect shining long term, there will be a period of kind of a market wobbling. That is something where the outcome of elections is important, and where this populism message by some candidates could have an impact, I would say. In the long term, things should be fine, but not in the long term. Lots of things can happen. Yeah.
Sure. The global environment has been very challenging for emerging markets in the last 3-4 months, right? And what struck me is quite a few research houses have come out with research reports trying to identify countries that are particularly vulnerable, right? And typically Turkey, Argentina. And it surprised me a little bit that I think Nomura, actually apologies, one of the competitors, but Nomura and I think Oxford Economics came out with reports putting Ukraine really high up in terms of vulnerability. Is that wrong? I mean, is there something they're looking at in terms of the macro sort of vulnerability data? I mean, it's open to anyone on the panel. Is there something in the data that raises red flags on Ukraine that's really not really an adequate reflection, or is that true? Is Ukraine really frontline?
Let me just maybe, I think I agree with you that there's something in the data, but these comparisons can be oversimplistic. I mean, they look at the variables like, let's look at the fiscal deficit and current account deficit, and if the country has both, they seem like a vulnerable one.
Ukraine doesn't really. I mean, its ratios, it has twin deficits, but they're not crazy twin deficits, right?
Yeah, so then one reads a bit deeper, and well, Ukraine is actually running a primary surplus, and if it continues, so, not counting interest rate payments, it has a primary surplus, which means its debt, for example, according to IIF, is actually projected to decline, not increase over time, and that sets it apart from the like of Turkey and Argentina. Also, the independence of Ukrainian central bank and its commitment to inflation targeting, and the fact that it kept monetary policy tight even through kind of a upswing in the cycle last year, is very commendable. And that's something else that sets it very much apart from Turkey or Argentina. I mean, in Argentina, central banks, half of the central bank's balance sheet was used to fund the government by issuing short-term bills to external investors. And in Turkey, the central bank also was not at all in the place to target inflation. Quite the opposite. You have the close relative of President Erdogan in charge. And so on that metric, I think Ukraine has much more solid domestic institutional foundations, and these oversimplified metrics paint a slightly distorted picture. I agree with you.
Any other takers in terms of?
Yeah, I think like somewhere where we cannot fully rely on data and where Ukraine scores very vulnerable is looking at its short-term external debt. it shows huge liabilities of the corporate sector. And then when we dig deeper, we discussed it with the National Bank. Sometimes in the service companies overstated, or there can be related party lendings or trade credits which are rolled over very easily. So those huge amounts to be repaid in the next year actually are not there. So these ratios sound too bad, but it's just because we don't have better quality statistics on the external liabilities. I agree. Something that vulnerability ratios do not account for, or not all of them, is the geopolitical situation or the military conflict. It's low intensity, at least that's the term they use, but it provides another layer of uncertainty. And I would say, yeah, for Ukraine, I would still on our rankings, we also did a sovereign stability indicator, and Ukraine scores lower in the CEMEA group among CEMEA country peers because of the twin deficits and low growth compared to what the economy is capable of. It has been growing faster, it can do much better, and after contracting by 20%, 2 to 3% growth is just unacceptable. It can really do better. Finally, the level of dollar-denominated government debt makes the debt to GDP ratio very sensitive to any hryvnia fluctuations. And very recently, like the episodes of currency instability show that population reaction can exacerbate currency moves. So yes, this makes country score lower than it could be. I must say that we do time series, and it showed significant improvement. So Ukraine was the most vulnerable, but it improved the most over the recent years. But it's still the most vulnerable. So still.
May I add just quickly? First of all, every methodology is not perfect. I mean, the study you mentioned has made a great job predicting like 60 or 70% of all currency crises, but not all of them. They predicted the currency crisis in Ukraine 2015, good job. 2016, not as a great job. Sometimes numbers are just not making perfect sense. For example, Czech Republic has 20% more chances of a currency crisis than Russia. Russia has 0% in that very study. But it doesn't mean that it's all great in Ukraine. No, one of the key factors of that study is foreign reserves to future import is it is less than 3 months right now. It's 2.9, and without external funding coming anytime soon, it's just going to go down further. Back to you.
Just maybe quickly note that I think that all these metrics should be used for the purpose that they are created for, right? So, for example, if it's in case of Ukraine, of course, the debt sustainability metrics are clearly something which is worrying and which is important for the market and all. But if you look at the vulnerability of the general economy, I think it's much more stable at the moment. I do think that there was quite a substantial fundamental structural adjustment within the economy, and the growth is robust. It will probably stay, and it will probably survive lack of IMF program. It will probably survive many other issues. Moreover, external shocks could actually accelerate growth, like additional devaluations or whatever. So something like that. Basically, the economy is actually quite resilient, but the debt sustainability definitely is a big question mark still, given the size of it.
Sure. I mean, Volodymyr, from the central, you've negotiated kind of a careful path on this vulnerability. You kind of suggested to the government they're kind of vulnerable, I guess, to push on the IMF program a little bit. At the same time, you've been quite careful not to kind of increase concerns for people like me in terms of vulnerability. I mean, how would you respond to those kind of studies that suggest there's kind of a high vulnerability? Where are you? Where's the National Bank in terms of that?
We can actually decrease this vulnerability by doing orthodox policy. So it's the best response that we can deliver. But again, we could have like coordination with the government. We could advise them, but it's like more we're an independent institution, so you're not gonna give too much advices to the government, not to have advice back to. So it's like the separation is needed. So by doing our job, we are like reducing these vulnerabilities.
That is a brilliant central bank answer. I have huge confidence in the National Bank of Ukraine now because of that answer. Wonderful, well done. I think, Alina, you alluded to growth, and you alluded to the fact that, you know, I mean, I think it's interesting to look at growth performance this year, and I think there was a revision up of the second quarter data to 3.8. And that's an achievement. You know, growth is definitely an achievement. And I think last year we were here, we had this debate about what's a good growth number for Ukraine and should we celebrate 3.8. And that's a big debate. I don't particularly want to have that. But I want to look for the year ahead, and probably for the whole panel, is, you know, from a macro perspective, I mean, for whoever wins the presidential elections and obviously then the parliamentary elections, you know, what's the one kind of reform policy that perhaps hasn't been done or hasn't been delivered well enough so far that could actually make a meaningful difference to growth, that could take, you know, 3.8 to 5? You know, what is it that's missing? I mean, what should be the big reform priority for the next administration?
I'll start from the very basics. To grow, the country needs one of the three, or maybe all three factors: either growth in population, or growth in investment, or growth in productivity. Total factor productivity is a low model. Unfortunately, with the first one, there is a challenge. The pickup in the migration, and that's the migration of the population in its most productive population, maybe like more educated. In terms of investment, currently Ukraine investment to GDP ratio is below 20%, and that has to be much higher compared to its country peers. It's pretty low. And productivity, again, the productivity statistics shows also that there was it's still positive growth, but very low. So in terms of population, it's hard to turn around things very quickly. So you really need to boost investment and to boost productivity. For that, you need help from everywhere, from the domestic economy and from abroad. I mean, sub $2 billion of foreign direct investment is extremely low, and it highlights that there are some serious issues which make investors question, question themselves whether I want to be here. And so the government does there is a lot of focus on that to attract foreign direct investment, and hopefully, the quantity of efforts will translate into quality of the FDIs coming sooner or later. But yeah, both for domestic and for foreign investors, the stability is needed. And for the business environment, just recently, sorry, I'm referring to Dragon Capital, but they sent this survey. I think they did it together with Kyiv School of Economics. But it seems that the problem number one still remains to be corruption. It's something that everyone talks about, something that hasn't been done, so this circle hasn't been closed. The panel is, what will we see in 1 year, how Ukraine will look in a year ahead. So next year, the same amount, at the same event, we will see whether anti-corruption court is created finally, and whether it works. And that's the very first step, right? It's the very first step in the many following needed actions to send some confidence, to improve legal environment, judicial system, and so on. Yeah, and to send a positive message which would make investors more confident in the economy.
I guess you had a question. The question states that the reforms which hasn't been started yet, right? So, I mean, I completely agree that the corruption is clearly very important, but there is definitely a lot of work been done, and a large part of them actually has been done. And we just need to implement the whole thing, right? So that's the question, which is of course important, but something so from what has not been touched upon, I guess, is the one big thing is the land reform, and that could potentially be a game changer for the whole, I guess, macroeconomic discussion from the debt sustainability discussion, because that puts a price tag on a big strategic asset, which a lot government holds still, and a lot of private individuals hold. It could attract significant FDI. Right on the spot, actually, most of the FDI to Ukraine are still directed to the land, to the agricultural sector. So I guess that's something what needs to be addressed, and where the positive surprise could come from.
Perfect.
I think I just want to second what Vladimir just said. To make it less abstract, the potential effects of land reform could be seen in over the last couple of years. If you look at which bank is ranked the best bank in Ukraine in Euromoney rankings, it's a
the National Bank of Ukraine.
Private bank, okay, of the private institutions. I mean, it's a sub of foreign bank, okay, Austrian bank. What did they do? In 2015, during the time of extreme uncertainty, they still got some capital from EBRD and bet huge on Ukrainian agricultural sector. In 2016, they were delivering very good profits. 2017, of course, they do more things than just agriculture, but it just shows you that they bet on Ukrainian agricultural sector and it paid off hugely. So I wish Ukrainian reform agenda progresses in that same direction, because we can see the potential.
Sure. Vladimir, can I ask you, again, you know, the National Bank have done many fantastic things in 4 years. I could list a long list of achievements, but, you know, what haven't you done yet that, you know, you think this is something really important and we really want to deliver that in the 12 months ahead? Or is there anything particularly that stands out that you know you could do that would really be game changing or would make a big difference?
I think there is always a room for improvement, but we are on the right path. And I think because as you mentioned, GDP growth this year, it's actually not too high, because Ukraine could have a higher growth rates. But from the other point of view, it's under our estimates, it's somewhat above the potential. So the problem is the potential GDP is too low. And what could be done about it, it's all these reforms that my colleagues mentioned. It's like judiciary system, rule of law, land reform. All this stuff could actually increase the potential GDP, and the economy of Ukraine could grow with higher rate, but at the same time not producing additional inflation, and we will not be so tight on monetary policy if all reforms will be done.
Can I ask you a very specific question? I mean, I think a couple of weeks ago there was a Bloomberg article about the National Bank no longer being kind of the lender of last resort for the government. I mean, not willing to fund the deficit. I mean, that was great from my perspective. From a foreign investor, this is a really standout change of direction from the central bank, going back 20 years, right? Is that reality? I mean, that was a very forthright statement. I mean, is that fact? I mean,
actually, it's very strong commitment from the board and supported by the Council of the NBU that there will be no fiscal dominance anymore, and the portfolio of government bonds will not increase, and it will decrease as the debt is paid off. So yes, there is strong commitment not to repeat this wrong practice of fiscal dominance.
Right, so I mean, statement to the government: go to the IMF or go to the market. Don't come knocking at the National Bank's door. It's locked. Okay, wonderful. We've got a bit of time for questions. So, any burning questions out there? Want to grill our wonderful panel?
So, if I may get back what Władysław said about the original thing and the foreign exchange denominated debt. So you gave some recommendation of how to get rid of this debt. You say that it's better to develop an internal securities market or derivatives market, and probably this is discussed in the other room right now. But from your point of view, what can be done, what actions can be done by the central bank to tackle this problem? Because the development of the securities market can take a lot of time, so it could last for years, but the FX debt is usually the reason of any crisis in Ukraine. So there is a legacy from the past. It could last for very long. So are there any actions that can be done, especially by the central bank?
Difficult one. I mean, I think central bank is already doing quite a lot at the moment. Credibility, consolidated government credibility is one of the main reasons why it's difficult for foreign investors to commit more to buying local currency debt, and why it's difficult for country to issue long-term debt, which would be ideal, because what you want is not the kind of hedge funds who are betting on carry and they're not there anymore when carry deteriorates. What you want is foreign institutional investors, domestic institutional investors, diversifying, among other things, into Ukrainian government debt for the purposes of risk diversification, not so much yield chasing. I think, I'm not sure what the central bank can do specifically, but it really comes down to developing domestic institutional investor base and domestic capital markets infrastructure and regulation. To the extent that the central bank is involved in those areas, I would say that that's kind of the direction.
Perfect. Anything else from the audience?
Yes, question about the interest rates policy. Because I would like just to start again from the remark of Anina about the weak level of investment and the very limited progress in terms of productivity. What are, according to the different panelists, the root causes of inflation, and how the current high interest rates are able to tackle these root causes? Because one of the causes seems to be related to the wage increases, which could be compensated by higher gain of productivity, but this required investment, which is not favored by high interest rates. So I would like to have more comments about that.
Actually, inflation is always a monetary phenomenon. So you just can deal with inflation by having higher interest rate. And what is the strategy is we will not have cheap loans if we will not bring inflation down and have it stable. So the strategy is to have stable inflation that will reduce the inflation risk, and that will allow to have more productivity in the economy. But it does not work other way. So we could not artificially lower the interest rate. At the same time, it will destabilize expectations. It will cause even higher interest rates. So there is no other ability to actually to do monetary policy in such environment. Yeah.
Anyone else on the panel want to take that one?
I just want to say that the experience of other countries, like for example Russia, right? Just 5-10 years ago, there was a huge debate, and there were great experts arguing that inflation in Russia is not monetary, it's set by fiscal, it's set by many other things, food, harvest, which is nothing to do with the interest rates. But in the end, it's all monetary, one way or another. I'm just trying to, this orthodox policy is the only way how to address the issue. And some other countries managed to do it, even though they did have fiscal dominance, they did have other factors, they did have, like, for example, high dependence on oil prices, like Russia, for example, right? But then inflation is 3.1%, which is now perceived as high, actually.
I think it's very easy to blame the central bank with still high inflation with such huge interest rates, but it's a monetary phenomenon. It also depends on the level of competition in the economy. The higher the competition is, the less pricing power the less pricing power there is in every sector, and the more the retailers, producers will try to bring their costs down to gain the share on the market, right? So there's some help from the government, some structural reforms needed in that area to improve competition. Help from the Ministry of Finance is needed. If you have expansionary fiscal policy, your rates can be, 25%, maybe 30%. It's very hard. Then I think the National Bank did a significant job building transmission mechanism and what it can do, right? It can affect saving preferences, controlling or affecting saving and spending behavior of households, of corporates, so in a way, every single institution has to do its job to achieve the goal, and National Bank on its own, without cooperation with others, would have to keep rates even higher than it would otherwise if we had definitely stability of the exchange rate, households' expectations of stable exchange rates, say through election period, and also if it would be confident in cooperation from the side of the Ministry of Finance and the say prudence of the fiscal policy. That's it.
Great. Any more questions of the audience? Maybe just one last. Oh, one at the end, back there. Oh,
So just very quickly, just one example, actually, additional to Russia. Actually, in Africa, this is Zimbabwe, right? Case, I think it is my favorite case. Again, huge number of people arguing that inflation there is nothing to do with monetary, fiscal, and things like that. Inflation was in well, I guess what it was like in billions percentage, and then something happened. Then they just cancelled the national currency, and inflation just disappeared. But nothing else changed, right? Except for that. So meaning that inflation is indeed just monetary, and it has to be dealt with exactly the monetary mechanisms. The transmission mechanisms could differ, but they still exist.
Okay, thanks. My name is Alexander Lubarev, Metinvest, the biggest exporter of this country. So just a question to you guys. I mean, you're looking very positively on everything once again. And my question here is very straightforward. Let's imagine tomorrow we have an IMF. Let's imagine that everything is good. There are elections in this country in the proper manner, and there are no populists coming to the power. So do you think the BB minus, BB flat is achievable for this country in the nearby, let's say, if not 12 months, but 18 months? Just assumption.
I think nothing is impossible, frankly. And we do think that continued IMF cooperation is one of the key factors for a rating improvement, specifically where you still have C handle. So yes, and definitely the rating upgrade story is definitely out there with the IMF.
Did you say BB though?
Nothing is impossible. Maybe not in the next year or so, but in the longer term, where everything is perfect, why not?
Just to remind you, a few years ago, Ukraine adopted strategy 2020, and the goal was for that year that we will have investment grade, so it's triple B. But
okay. Actually, there's going to sneak in one more question from myself, and again, it's kind of aimed at the central bank, but I'm not going to ask you the question. I'm going to ask the other kind of conspirators that I've got on the panel, and I guess it's about central bank independence, right? Because basically, the National Bank has worked really hard to, really fought really hard to generate this level of independence that I think we'd all acclaim now. I mean, but how easy is that? Could that be lost through the election cycle? I mean, are you confident I mean, how assured should we be about this independence? I mean, if we see a political change, I mean, how easy is it to erode this really hard-won independence? I mean, are you assured by the management of the central bank at the moment that they can fight their way through a new set of politicians?
Okay, technically it's easy. The president submits the bill to the Rada, and if he or she gets enough approval, if the Rada, the new governor is installed of NBU, and it would depend on the personality of that very governor. It would be hard to do, consider the dependence on the IMF and external funding, but I wouldn't say it's impossible.
Any other takers? No. Okay. Wonderful. I think we've run out of time, so I'd just like you to thank our wonderful panel with a warm hand of applause. Thank you very much. Enjoy your dinner. Cheers, yeah? Well done.